Well, we started out the month of May with Pluralism Sunday, celebrating the religious pluralism and diversity of our great country, and I decided to save the most interesting and perhaps the most controversial topic for today, the last Sunday in our series. We're going to be talking about Islam. Huston Smith is a great scholar of world religions, and he said that Islam is the most persistently misunderstood religion in the world, and especially here in the West. Here's a couple of examples. Just a few years ago, there were some American citizens who also happened to be Muslims who wanted to buy some land in places like Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Temecula, California, and Sheboygan, Wisconsin, to build either a mosque or an Islamic community center. Now, how do you think the neighbors responded to that here in the land of the free and the home of the brave? You know, in the United States, we have these wonderful, wonderful documents called the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. The Declaration tells us about the natural right of all people, especially citizens, but all people, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Bill of Rights says that we have the right to practice our own religion freely as we choose. Well, as soon as the Murfreesboro Islamic Center received a building permit, they had to deal with public protests, vandalism, arson of one of the construction vehicles, and a bomb threat. And then the opponents did something that is so American. They held a protest rally and they lawyered up. They sued the county to stop the construction. Now, get this. The attorneys went into court, and I guess attorneys can say a lot of things with a straight face. I should know. I did it for 20 years. The attorneys claimed in court that Islam was not a real religion deserving First Amendment protection. They also claimed that these local Muslims were part of a plot to overthrow the U.S. Constitution and replace it with the dreaded Sharia law. You know, that's the boogeyman of the day. They were, of course, unable to prove those claims, and the case was thrown out, and the center proceeded to completion. And in California and Wisconsin, the protesters, they were on the march as well. Yeah, that's Murfreesboro. It says "Not Welcome" spray painted over the sign that says future site of the Islamic Center. And they were on the march in the other locations as well. So, I don't know, so much for freedom and liberty, I guess. Can you imagine what would happen if anyone did the same thing in response to a Christian church being built somewhere in this country? Oh, but they say, it's all different with Islam. That's because they got this book called the Quran that says some outlandish things in it. For instance, Muslims are supposed to go out and convert unbelievers. Convert people to their own religion? I mean, who ever heard of such a thing? Can you imagine Christians going into another country and converting people and then erecting churches and cathedrals there? Can you imagine Jewish people going into a land that was occupied by another culture and taking it by force and then erecting their temples and imposing their religious laws? Who ever heard of such a thing? Okay, so maybe that's not such a good reason to single out Islam. But what about all the violent stuff that we find in the Quran? People single out the Quran as promoting violence and aggression, and you can go through the Quran and you can find some very violent passages and passages that seem to be actually inciting violence. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood. And his name is called the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, wearing fine white linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, And he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh, he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Wow. A rod of iron and will rule the nation. Terrible, terrible stuff, isn't it? Except that's not the Quran. That's the Holy Bible. That's the book of Revelation. The guy on the horse is actually Jesus. And that's just part of a long list of similar passages that we can find in the Bible. Here's one from 1 Samuel, verse 15, where God tells King Saul to go and attack the Amalekites. This one is short, not so sweet. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Wow. You know, that's pretty bad stuff. Genocide, scorched earth. There's a Hebrew word for what God is telling Saul to do in that passage. The Hebrew word is herem, which means total annihilation. Total annihilation as commanded by God. And so Christianity is kind of latched onto this because Christianity has its own historical tradition of herem. For instance, during the Crusades in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Pope declared that the Muslims were the new Amalekites. Destroy them utterly. And then we have the great religious wars that happened in the 16th, 17th, and 19th centuries. Catholics and Protestants interchangeably called the other side the Amalekites in an invitation to destroy them utterly. Lots of passages in the Bible that are similar, that drove the enslavement of Africans, the massacres of Native Americans. And the actual fact is that if you sit down and count up the verses, the Bible is far more bloody and violent than the Quran. But you know what? It's not like this is a competition. The so-called sacred scriptures of the world have more than enough violence to go around. And as far as I'm concerned, there is nothing sacred about that kind of stuff. And in the hands of a fundamentalist or an extremist, Christian, Jew, or Muslim, those kind of violent passages can be very dangerous. They're used to radicalize people. But it's interesting because the fact is that Christians and Jews, for the most part, have given up the kind of institutionalized violence that we still see being promoted by Islamic extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So how do we explain the difference? Well, there's a guy who studied this, Professor Philip Jenkins at Penn State University. He's an expert on the subject, and this is his explanation. He says, what happens in all religions as they grow and mature and expand, they go through a process of forgetting of the original violence. And I call this a process of holy amnesia. They make the violence symbolic. Wiping out the enemy becomes wiping out one's own sins. It's an interesting observation. And what he calls holy amnesia, we could call evolution. Instead of necessarily a forgetting of something, we're evolving to a higher, deeper understanding. Islam is going through that process right now. And one of the things that it helps to remember is that Islam is maybe around 600 to 700 years younger than Christianity in terms of going through the phases that every culture goes through. So naturally, it's probably going to take a little bit longer. And it helps sometimes to put things into perspective. There are approximately 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. They're not all just going to give up their religion. It's not going to happen. But think about Al-Qaeda for a moment. At its peak, Al-Qaeda had maybe 30, 40,000 fighters. What does that amount to as a percentage of 1.2 billion? Not much. But we still have the voices out there who try to tell us that we're facing this cataclysmic battle of cultures, good and evil, Islam versus the West. You know, the truth is that the biggest battle is going on between the radical factions within the Islamic community. Islamic extremists have killed far more Muslims than non-Muslims, and they continue to do so, just like the Christians did during the Inquisition and the Reformation and at other times. But we still have the voices out there who tell us that, oh well, Islam is different, and then they like to bring out a particular verse from the Quran, the 5th verse of the 9th surah, which is translated popularly like this: kill the infidels wherever you find them. Mistranslated and taken out of context. That translation is inaccurate. The word that gets mistakenly translated as infidel actually works out like this. The word actually literally means those who join other gods with God. The word that is translated as infidel really might be better translated as polytheists, people who worship many gods and many goddesses. And that really starts to make sense, because when you look at the context of the time that this passage was written, this passage came down at a time when Muhammad was at war, not with Jews, not with Christians, but was at war with his own Arab people who happened to be practitioners of polytheism in the Arab city of Medina. So, this verse is properly limited to that particular war with that particular enemy in that city. But that doesn't stop extremists from using this passage to promote their agenda. But where have we seen that happen before? We saw the same thing happen with God's order to Saul to kill the Amalekites. Christian extremists used it to promote an agenda of genocide. And actually, Islam was doing a pretty darn good job with this whole holy amnesia thing. You know, they were going through their evolution up until the late 1950s. Up until that time, the prevailing idea of this word jihad had to do with the internal struggle within each individual to do what was right. And from a military standpoint, when the word jihad was used in terms of warfare, it meant that warfare was justified only when a Muslim nation was attacked. It was purely defensive in nature. That was the prevailing understanding. Until in the late 1950s, there was an Egyptian Muslim named Sayyid Qutb who wrote a book that put a radical spin on all of these things, put a radical spin on jihad, put a radical spin on this verse about killing infidels, and the book he wrote became the basic textbook of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which soon became the face of Islam to the rest of the world. And now we have people in this country promoting the idea that every Muslim is a terrorist and every mosque a launching pad for suicide bombers. They want us to believe that Islam is the enemy. Well, Islam is not the enemy. The enemy is religious fundamentalism in any form. Any group that believes that its scriptures are the literal commands and words of God has the potential to use those scriptures to justify violence and oppression. There's nothing sacred about violent scriptures. Violent scriptures are a monument to human greed and depravity. They are a shallow and short-sighted attempt to justify that which cannot be justified. We need to look at violent scriptures for what they are. They're a record of human failure. They're a record of our failure to measure up to our potential goodness. They're a chronicle of human cruelty. We don't make excuses. We don't try to justify them. We look at it and we say that that kind of conduct is categorically unacceptable for anyone. We reject it. We need to look at violent scriptures as a snapshot of human evolution, a very low point on the spiral of evolution. And from that standpoint, they do have value. They provide an ugly picture of where we've been as a species. And the message is clear. The message is don't go back. Don't glorify it. Don't regard it as holy or the Word of God, and don't try to justify it. In Unity, we like to do something that we call holding the high watch, which means that we look at the negative events in the world from an evolutionary perspective. We hold to a vision of this eventual shift in consciousess spiral that leads us from violence to peace and harmony. That's holding the high watch. Every culture, every religion, and I would suggest every individual has to face its own demons of extremism and fundamentalism and violence in the name of God. And in the long run, what we've seen are the voices of reason and progressive values eventually winning out. Our culture has been through it, and I want to hold the vision that the same thing is happening for our Muslim brothers and sisters. Because let's face it, they're the ones who are suffering the most at the hands of deluded people who are using violent scriptures to feed their own ego-driven agendas of domination and conquest and control and whatever else it is that the shadow side of human beings likes to do with these things. And we can see it starting to happen. Within Islamic culture, within Islam, there's a movement that you've probably heard of. Have you heard of Sufis? Sufism? The Sufis never lost sight of the fact that Islam was, first and foremost, a way to practice love and devotion to God. For them, Islam was never meant to be a political movement or a tool for building an empire. For Sufis, substance is way more important than form. The external should yield to the internal. It's all about an internal spiritual process of purification. Matter should yield to meaning. Inner reality is more important than an outward symbol. One of the things that they say is to love the water more and the pitcher less. If you want to get a really good sense of what Sufism is all about, read some poetry by a guy named Rumi, who's become very popular in the last 20 years or so. You'll come away with a new appreciation for where Islamic culture is going and what it has to offer the world from this perspective. And in the handout in your bulletin, I've given you a website that you can go to. Krista Tippett has a wonderful radio program called On Being, and she devoted an entire program to the poetry of Rumi, and there are links there to his poetry with English translations. So you might want to check that out. And for the more adventurous among you, I came across a new website that is called Free Arabs. This is remarkable. Their motto is democracy, secularism, and fun. And over on this tab here of Who Are We? Here's what they say. Here's how they describe themselves. They say that we are a group of free-minded bloggers, journalists, activists, and creators. We are dispersed throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and the rest of the world. Keen on perpetuating the spirit of the Arab Spring, we confront both oppressive autocrats and religious zealots with audacious reporting, candid whistleblowing, and ferocious derision. I love that last part, ferocious derision. I would love to hang out. They sound like people I'd like to hang out with, and there's some really interesting stuff on that website. If you want to see where the cutting edge is, people are saying, where are the voices of moderate Islam or progressive Arab culture? in response to the stuff we see going on in the world driven by religious extremists and fundamentalists, there it is. And those are some brave people because they're putting their name on it as well. They're standing up and they're saying the things that people have been saying we need to be hearing all along. Evolution works. The oppressive autocrats, the religious zealots will go the way of the dinosaur, and folks like this are the ones that are helping to show them the door. So I hope this gives you an example and some ideas about how you might be able to help to hold the high watch, to give all of us around the world the space to grow and to evolve, to be the best human beings that we can be, no matter what we believe, no matter what a particular religion happens to be. Happy Memorial Day, everyone, and we'll see you next Sunday. Actually, I won't see you next Sunday, but Karen will be here, so see you in 2 weeks.